Conservatives are losing their minds over DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas telling Cuban and Haitian, by the way, asylum seekers to avoid coming to the United States as refugees by sea. So let's first hear his statement, and then I'll give you a little taste of conservatives freaking out about it.
Allow me to be clear. If you take to the sea, you will not come to the United States. The time is never right to attempt migration by sea. To those who risk their lives doing so, this risk is not worth taking. Again, I repeat, do not risk your life attempting to enter the United States illegally. You will not come to the United States.
So that statement was honestly reminiscent of what Kamala Harris told the Guatemalan people during her trip to Guatemala. She very clearly said, don't come if you're seeking asylum, which was pretty disgusting. And I want to be clear that for me and for, I think, most people on the left, we don't pick and choose which immigrants or which asylum seekers we want to accept into the country. You know, it doesn't matter if they're Mexican, Central American. It doesn't matter if they're from Cuba, Haiti. We have a system in place for asylum seekers. That system was essentially squashed under the Trump administration, citing coronavirus as a reason for denying entry for all asylum seekers. And unfortunately, Joe Biden continued on with that policy, which I think is just completely wrong given what we've done to destabilize many of the countries that refugees are coming in from or asylum seekers are coming in from. Now, with that said, I mentioned that conservatives are freaking out about this. Why? Well, this morning I noticed that the word Mexicans was trending on Twitter, and I'm like, Mexicans, why? So I click on it, and it's a bunch of conservatives who are like, oh yeah, they'll let all the Mexicans in, but what about these communist-hating, pro-democracy Cubans? Why can't we let them in? I'm okay with letting them in, but can we not pick and choose based on ideological reasons? This screenshot is from Sean Hannity's website. Must see, Biden's DHS secretary tells pro-democracy Cubans do not come to the United States. And so, Daniel, I want to bring you in. Daniel Bessner is a historian and the host of American Prestige, a foreign policy podcast that you guys should check out. Daniel, it's interesting because while conservatives are panicking about that statement, if you really take a step back and look at US policy toward Cuban immigration versus immigration from everywhere else, there has been a lot of favoritism for Cubans. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I think it's important to recognize within the United States, there's a lot of different powerful ethnic lobbies that are associated along ethnic lines and often organized around diasporic communities. And for decades, since the Cuban Revolution, there has been a powerful, generally conservative-leaning right-wing Cuban lobby in Miami and in Florida. And so there's that lobby has been powerful in basically affecting how the United States treats Cuba. And I just want to emphasize that the United States had never treated Cuba or Haiti or the Dominican Republic particularly well ever in its history from various occupations and military interventions. But the power of that lobby did inform US policy toward the island for a long time. And what's particularly galling about the Biden administration's approach to it, and the Republican stuff to me is just classic political hypocrisy. I'm not particularly surprised about it. But what's particularly galling about the Biden administration's approach is that the one thing this country has is a lot of land. And the one thing that it could actually do in foreign policy that isn't some sort of intervention or manipulation of economics or politics is to allow people into the country. It's fairly low cost. It could actually be connected to jobs programs for American citizens here, relocation programs, resettlement programs, things along those lines. But to just dismiss it like that, first, it seems to indicate that the Biden administration is trying to protect its right flank on immigration. It's basically promoting a more xenophobic, nationalist foreign policy. And you see that not only with this case, but also with how it's talking about China. And so we see this basically moved to the right that I think has defined a lot of the Biden administration's foreign policy, which I would say is defined by the maintenance of hegemony. That is really the goal of the early administration. It recognizes that it can't overstep like it did under Bush, or to some degree under Obama, particularly with regards to Libya, but it's trying to still maintain the hegemonic principle of US global empire. And again, this is one of the many reasons it's a shame that Bernie didn't win. He would have done something different. But I think Biden is a very status quo person, and this is a very status quo foreign policy.
For the audience members who might not be as steeped into, political literature or political science, what do you mean when you say hegemonic?
The idea that the United States, which has about 750 military bases, basically controls a lot of the international institutions and has an international economy organized around the American dollar, just means that the United States is able to, in very serious and direct ways, govern what happens internationally. And so I think what the Biden administration is trying to do in the face of relative American decline, it's not 1945, for example. The United States doesn't have 50% of world production. It's not even 1991 when the United States is the sole superpower. There's the rise of China, the rise of India, Russian revanchism, et cetera. What the Biden administration, I think, is trying to do is to make American hegemony possible for this new, not quite multipolar, but no longer unipolar world. And I think if you read a lot of the administration's actions through that lens, they become very understandable. So I don't think Biden, for example, will intervene in Cuba, but I think he'll do what he can to maintain total US dominance of Cuba, or US control, not dominance, obviously because of the revolution, but US control of the region without actually putting much on the line.
Right, and keeping the embargo and sanctions in place, I would imagine, is part of that equation. I also want to just go back to the broader story about Cuba this week, which of course involves thousands of protesters taking to the street to protest a variety of issues, including the handling of COVID. Some, I'm sure, are unhappy with the authoritarian nature of the government and also some of the suppression of speech. But what's interesting is, the overwhelming commentary that I've seen from the protesters is their frustration with food shortages and the lack of coronavirus vaccines. And those are two things that could easily be alleviated if the United States were to lift these sanctions and lift the embargo. The embargo and the sanctions specifically indicate, this is what was implemented during the Trump administration, that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. Right, and so as a result, international banks are afraid to do business with Cuba. They're afraid to finance any of Cuba's, domestic policies or projects, and so it actually has had an incredibly negative impact on Cuba, and it also prevents the wire transfer of American currency to Cuban citizens, which, there were Cubans in America sending money to their family in Cuba. They're no longer able to do that as a result of these sanctions. So it has been crippling for them. Now with that,
and that's an example. Just very quickly, that's an example of how hegemony works, right? The US government has some sort of designation for Cuba based again on this war on terror logic that George W. Bush initiated. And through that logic of hegemony is actually able to really harm the island, really harm people in Cuba itself. And this is how hegemony works without direct military intervention. You could still have disastrous effects on local politics throughout the world by virtue of the United States' sheer and enormous power.
Right, and these sanctions aren't just implemented in Cuba, of course. The same tactic is being utilized in Iran, in Syria, and the people who bear the brunt of these sanctions are the citizens, and intentionally so, because the whole thinking, the idea behind it is people will be so crushed economically speaking and so desperate that it might spark an uprising against the very regime that the United States would like to topple. So the attempt to hurt people economically is very much an intentional effort.
Exactly. And I think it's important to underline that sanctions are not a form of so-called clean war, which is how they're often presented. They have disastrous and direct effects on people's lives. The denying of medicine, the denying of access to capital, and things that really make people's lives demonstrably worse. And I think that one of the sort of falsehoods of the 1990s and even parts of the 2000s were that sanctions were, a substitute, an ethical, humane substitute for military intervention. And I don't think that's true. And I think people are beginning to recognize that they have disastrous effects.
I want my team to get the last video ready. It's the last clip in this story because I think it's worth talking about. So, a lot of the messaging toward the protests in Cuba coming from conservatives in the United States, but not just conservatives. I think the media narrative in the United States has been one that focuses solely on the economic system implemented in Cuba, and of course that's communism. And I thought that this line of questioning during a recent press conference was really fascinating because there was a lot of outrage at how Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, responded to this question. Take a listen to what the question is, and let's discuss, what the intentions are here.
Do you think that people are leaving Cuba because they don't like communism?
I think we've been pretty clear that we think people are leaving Cuba or not leaving Cuba or protesting in the streets as well because they are opposed to the oppression, to the mismanagement of the government in the country. And we certainly support their right to protest. We support their efforts to speak out against their treatment in Cuba.
So Daniel, there was some outrage on Twitter over the way she answered that because she didn't give a straight answer condemning communism. But I wanted you to react to it. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's some hard-hitting journalism. I mean, let me tell you, that's exactly what White House reporters should be asking. I mean, it's absolutely absurd and just shows how the problems with a press that essentially needs to rely on these types of sources for their access and therefore for their livelihood. I mean, it's an absolutely absurd question. I mean, one could equally ask, are they leaving because the United States had made it impossible to live in Cuba for decades? Or something as equally a leading question from the other side. And to me, that exchange just reveals the problems at the heart of access journalism of the type that really defines a lot of White House coverage, which is just not very critical. That takes a lot of the assumptions of American imperialism and American hegemony for granted. And that is one of the major reasons, and the media is one of the major reasons that, for example, this country got into Iraq and this country has provided cover for numerous interventions and for things like dollar hegemony throughout the world. And so to me, it just highlights the problems with journalism in that way.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.